308. So I just want to introduce the, I would like to now introduce the next speaker. Damon Small, also known as Chef. He's a diehard sports fan. Anyone from Louisiana here? Anyone from Louisiana? Anyone? Wow, no one. Anyone a fan of the LSU Tigers here? Tigers. Okay, he's a fan of the LSU Tigers. You're also a dad as a hockey player. Oh, thank you. We'll stop up. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce someone we've known you for a while now, Chef.
Thank you, Ming. Very much appreciated. Let me log in. Sorry. All right. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the Wall of Sheep for putting this on every year. This is my second year as a volunteer with the Wall of Sheep. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun, and I'm privileged to not only be a volunteer with this great organization this year, but also here presenting to you. And thank you all for coming. We're at a new location here on the 26th floor. We're thrilled that you continue to support us in the way you do. As Ming mentioned, my name is Chef. You can call me Damon as well if you prefer. I do have a son that's a hockey player, as he briefly mentioned. I want to just briefly and selfishly give a shout out to my son, ch3f 24, who turned 13. Turned 13 today, so I am the father of a teenager. I am not at all qualified to have that job. Yeah. So shout out to ch3f, Brody's his real name, and I want to talk to you today about Eisenhower and the interstate, and Eisenhower and the internet, and what those two things have to do with one another. So, brief introduction. I need to also thank my employer, who is supporting me being here today. NCC Group. We're a global security firm, founded in '99. We're very big, 1,800 employees globally. You can read that, but I'm happy to answer questions if you like. But let's just move on. Enough about them. Let's talk about me. My name, that was a joke. Didn't work this time, did it? All right. My name is Damon, technical PM for the NCC Group. I've been in InfoSec since 2001. I've been in IT since 1995, in InfoSec since 2001. As Ming said, I am a Louisiana native. Been in Texas for 20 years, and as we say in Texas, I'm not from Texas, but I got there as fast as I could. Studied music at Louisiana State. Go Tigers. Don't anyone throw anything at me if you're not a Tiger fan. And I went to grad school in 2005 for information assurance to try and make myself feel like a legit geek, I guess. So I've done a lot of blue team InfoSec and healthcare for the DoD and aerospace at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and also in oil and gas. So that's a little bit about me. And let's jump into Eisenhower and the internet. And this whole narrative began years ago. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, and he made the comment, we were talking about the myriad problems we have in securing information assets for people. And basically the question was, why didn't they think of that? And it occurred to me that that's a perfectly legitimate question. Why do we have these problems, and why couldn't we see that these things were going to be problems, and why didn't they think of that? It's a simple and honest question, and I think the answer lies with how the internet came to be. It's an important question because as information security practitioners, we have to understand why the technology is the way it is, how people will use it, and how malicious users will leverage design flaws to steal information. So why didn't they think of that? Let's explore that question a little further and try and find that out. Before I start to answer that, though, it is hot, so as much as I love my lab coat, yeah, it's a little warm. So we're going to start first by talking about Eisenhower and his interstate system. And bear with me here. I'm going to loop these things together. I trust you. So this is a little bit of a history lesson first. The idea for a national interstate system began in 1919. Then Eisenhower, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower, was involved in a road trip from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It involved 80 military vehicles. It covered 3,000 miles, and it took 2 months. And you can see from one of those pictures there that there were no highways. There were roads that didn't have big shoulders, and the vehicles were constantly getting stuck in ditches and breaking down. And Eisenhower realized that if it takes 2 months to move military vehicles from one coast to the other, it's going to be difficult to defend the country in the event that there would be any kind of war activity on American soil. So he knew that that wasn't a good solution, and that something had to be done. Years later, he was in Europe in the 1930s. If you think of your world history, in the 1930s in Germany in particular, there were some things going on. And he discovered that the Germans, being very efficient, had already built a national interstate system at that time. And it reinforced the idea in Eisenhower's mind that having a national road system was critical to the nation's security, but also to its economy, to be able to move things easily across great distances. So when he became president, he supported the idea of a nationwide infrastructure here in the United States that would not only facilitate military objectives, but also create jobs and boost the economy. So let's recap that for a minute. The initial requirement was to facilitate the movement of military vehicles around the country easily. But the result was that a private industry was created that helped build the roads, and created an entire culture around this new infrastructure. Let me go back to that. Forgot a point. So, it wasn't just building the roads for the military, but once private citizens were able to use these roads, we were able to travel easily from place to place. Entire towns sprung up around where these roads were, and it did have a huge impact on commerce across the entire country. So because of his experiences, he fought hard to get Congress to pass the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. So for that reason, today we do refer to it as the Eisenhower Interstate System. If you've been traveling, perhaps you've seen those signs along the side of the road. So as the father of the interstate system, Congress passed a bill in 1990 that legally changed the name to the Dwight D. Eisenhower System of Interstate and Defense Highways. And that's an important name because that defense word is still in there. It still has an important role should it need to be used in defense of this country. So as I mentioned, we've got a car culture in this country, but also elsewhere. So when you facilitate transportation very well, interesting things tend to happen. For example, in around 1900 in France, the Michelin Guide was published. Michelin as in the tire company. So it's a little non-intuitive. Why would the Michelin Guide for fine dining and restaurants be published by a tire company? Well, the answer is that the Michelin Company knew if they could publish a book of really nice restaurants that people had to drive to get to, then they would drive their car more and need to buy more tires, and therefore it would be profitable for them to publish this book to get people to drive. As I mentioned earlier, entire towns existed only to support the interstate. I'm sure we've all seen the movie Cars, right? I mean, it's part of our culture. Route 66, which ran from Chicago to Santa Monica, about 2,500 miles, provided jobs for everyone that lived nearby. Now, to be fair, Route 66 is not actually a part of the national highway system. It was built before the highway system existed, but it's a great example of car culture in this country. While I was doing research on this is an interesting bit of trivia here. Does anyone know where the middle of Route 66 is? Anyone? Is there anyone else here from Texas, by the way? I know there's no new. It's in Texas. It's not. Well, it might be near there. All right, so for the Texans in the room, it's in Adrian, Texas. I'm not even sure I know where that is, to be honest with you. I just thought it was an interesting trivia question. So what's my point? The point is that what started as an infrastructure built for a very specific use case ended up having a profound economic and sociological effect once turned over to the private sector. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like any other government-based infrastructure or government-funded infrastructure? So let's jump over to the internet now that I've told that narrative. The DoD wanted to create a system that would allow for geographically dispersed computers to communicate with one another. If there was some sort of catastrophic event that disrupted the largely centralized computer capabilities that they had at the time, they were afraid that they would not be able to share the information they needed to defend this country. So if they could come up with some way for these geographically dispersed systems to communicate with one another, then perhaps they could do a better job at sharing information during disaster or war or whatever. Well, a funny thing happened in 1958. Eisenhower funded ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency, directly in response to the Russians having launched Sputnik. So it was actually the space race that started ARPA, and the Americans, we were surprised. We had no idea the Russians were doing this. All of a sudden, they've launched a satellite, and we were taken off guard. So Eisenhower knew, okay, we've got to have somebody in the government that's doing scientific research in a collaborative way so we don't get taken off guard ever again. So shortly, NASA was formed and took over the space race stuff, and ARPA at that time began in the 1960s to focus on computer science types of issues. So that's how ARPA came to be. By the way, in 1972, they changed their name to DARPA, the DoD Advanced Research Projects Agency. Then in 1993, it was changed back to ARPA, and in 1996, once again, back to DARPA. So not sure why they keep changing the name and rebranding themselves, but just, again, a little more trivia there. So the DoD knew they couldn't do it alone. I mean, they have the ability to get large sums of money and to start programs and those sorts of things. So they had to collaborate with academia and other academic agencies that could provide research. So there was a lot of people in America, but also people all over the world that were working on the various technologies that would be required to make something like the internet happen. And by the way, guess who was in charge of starting ARPA? Well, it was Eisenhower again. So I didn't know that at the time when I started, putting the story together. But so the same guy who started the huge infrastructure for the interstate system also started ARPA. The first 4 nodes of what was called at the time the ARPANET came online. Oh, excuse me, forgot a point. And so in 1958, that's when it was founded. And the goal was to, come up with the technologies, as I mentioned, that they would need to do the routing and switching. So they came online. The first 4 nodes were the University of California, Los Angeles, Stanford Research Institute, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. So that, all right, a fan. So this is what the topology map of the internet looked like in December 1969 with 4 nodes. That's a pretty straightforward topology map. Has anyone seen a map of the internet, fairly recently? You know what that one looks like? I mean, it looks like a neural network. I mean, there are so many nodes on there. It may be impossible to really even understand how many nodes are actually there. So the first message was actually sent on ARPANET on October 29th, 1969 at 22:30. They were going to type log on. They got the L and the O typed, and then it crashed. I would like to take this opportunity, however, at the Packet Hacking Village, the Wall of Sheep, to start the rumor that the actual message that they had intended to type was, in fact, LOL. it's just a funnier story, but I don't think that's an actual command for anything. So the key concepts involved in getting these 4 nodes talking. Oh, and by the way, so that was at October 29th. The system crashed. A few hours later, the first permanent connection was established on the 21st of November. So they finally got it back up and stable and working. And so we like to think of it, ARPA and ARPANET, as a distinctly American thing. And to be fair, it was Eisenhower and ARPA, and that's where the idea came from. But in my research, I found there were people from all over the world that were involved in the development of the protocols and the routing and switching technology. And so I don't think it's fair anymore to say, well, it's certainly not fair to say that Al Gore invented the internet. Every time I give the elevator pitch of this presentation, that joke invariably comes up. So there was people from all over the world. It was a big, huge collaborative effort. So I think what we can really conclude is that it was invented by humans in the 20th century. Yet it was a big deal. But not only was it invented by humans in the 20th century, but it was for very specific purposes. The design requirements didn't fully account for unauthorized users and for non-private networks, for example. So if you think about those first 4 nodes and then any of the nodes that followed that were research organizations and universities that were approved by the DoD to participate in the research, all of the users were pretty well known. You couldn't even access the network unless you were a part of one of those research organizations. So it's not that they didn't think of it, but the problem they were trying to solve at that time looked nothing at all like the problems we try to solve today as security researchers or as users of global networks. It just wasn't in the design book at all. So as with the interstate, once it was built and private industry started using it, we saw a distinct change in the nature of ARPANET when e-commerce happened. It's interesting to me that up until 1995, ARPANET still had a lot of control over what we could do with the internet, and in fact, e-commerce was specifically prohibited. So UUNet, the first non-profit internet access company, didn't even exist until around 1988. They went for-profit in 1990. The World, around that same time in 1989, offered internet access, and they were also the first company that was able to offer full access to non-ARPA approved users by 1992. Now, in 1992, that wasn't that long ago, at least not for me. Being old and having a teenage son and all that stuff. But before that, you could have access to the internet, but it wasn't necessarily the entire internet. It was just those parts that those companies were able to expose to its end users. So by 1992 was the first time that we could even really access the entire global network. And eBay and Amazon didn't happen until the mid-90s because it was just simply against the law to perform e-commerce on the internet. That kind of blew my mind. I mean, I did have email accounts in school and everything back in the 90s, but it just didn't occur to me that there was, in fact, a time that we didn't have Amazon and eBay and things. Now, I said that e-commerce didn't exist before the mid-90s. That's not really fair to say. I mean, e-commerce did exist, but it wasn't necessarily above board. I found an interesting article here. The first e-commerce, 71, 72 or so, is believed to have been some weed that a drug deal was brokered using ARPANET back then. So you could say that the earliest examples of e-commerce were actually back in the 70s, and yeah, I thought that was funny. So what's that have to do with us? So the security concept, as I mentioned, is the initial design requirements of an infrastructure are not necessarily what they evolve into. ARPA didn't have any facilities of its own, so it had to engage with academia to help to develop the technology and to design it. Just as America's roads were fueled for America's love for automobiles and exploring cities, the internet allowed people to exchange information across vast distances. And this matured from the first application of simple email to e-commerce to delivery of streaming media and remote control of a variety of devices and the Internet of Things. Just go over to Sheep City over there, and you can see some things that have IP stacks and can talk on the Internet that I'm quite sure the researchers in the 60s didn't think, oh, well, we better put something in the protocol spec to make sure the garage door opener doesn't get attacked, right? I mean, it just wouldn't have crossed their mind. So I think we can all appreciate these concepts that we far exceeded ARPA's intention from 50 years ago with what they wanted to do with this network. So what are we going to do about it? I mean, there's been, since the first roads were built, it's not only just that the roads are better and more mature, we have smarter vehicles as well, but there is a concept of these so-called smart roads. And I found this on a website called 80smartcorridor.org, and you can see it's no longer just a hard flat surface, right? I mean, we've got ramp meters that will control the flow of traffic onto roads. We have overhead signs that will give drivers critical information that they need to know about what's going on ahead of them, and local street signs that will change and reroute traffic depending on conditions on the roads as one. So I've got a series of predictions. I'm not at all going to say that I'm an authority on this, but I hope if nothing else it starts or continues the discussion of what we know what the internet is like now, what is it going to look like in the future, and what do we need to do to prepare for it. So as I mentioned, it started off as a hard flat surface. We've got adaptive construction materials now that we can use to build roads. We've got toll roads that help pay for things, and by virtue of the fact that people have to pay to use the roads, it might meter the traffic a little bit, and the lighting and dynamic lanes. And again, we've got self-driving cars that are becoming a reality now. Maybe we'll have the cars that will deal with getting us safely where we're going and communicate with one another. So similarly, I think what we still use particles to transfer information, and we're going to see more sophisticated ways, and in quantum computing is one example that comes to mind. But we started off with a simple internetworking infrastructure. Oh, which by the way, I'd like to mention that word internetworking, that was the first verb that they used to describe what they were trying to do. That the computers were internetworking with one another, and it was shortened to internet. And so that the internet is just a shortened, made-up word for internet working. And of course, now it's a proper noun, and it should always be capitalized, by the way. So we'll have math-based encryption that will include elements of quantum computing. Broadband will become more and more broad and ubiquitous. And I think one key thing that as we have that more broadband and we're able to protect data more effectively, physical possession of things will continue to lose value. And access to the information is really going to be the currency as we continue through the 21st century. The example I'll give, so my undergrad's in music, right? So if I asked you to guess what my CD collection looked like, you might think it's pretty impressive because I really, really like music. Well, the fact of the matter is I don't own a single CD anymore at all. Now, I have access to lots and lots of music, but it's all through music services or data that's stored in various cloud sorts of things and concepts like that. So I no longer care that I have access to the physical object. Rather, I'm more concerned that I just have access to the information so that I can consume it in a meaningful way. InfoSec challenges seem like they keep moving up the OSI model from layer 3. I mean, network-based attacks are certainly still a real thing, and they're going to continue. Excuse me. But I think we obviously, with web application testing being a big deal these days, I think we're going to continue to see as we move security models up to the top of the OSI stack, that we're going to continue to see attacks against specific applications. So just as we have the smart highways, as I mentioned, and self-driving cars, I think with the Internet 2 project, where they're trying to basically replicate the internet infrastructure. I think we're redoing it with modern materials, as it were, and modern protocols is going to be a big part of the solution. But I think it's still up to us to try and think about these things and go through these thought experiments and try and anticipate what are the bad guys going to do next to coerce our users into silly things. And to that point, even with cars that have autopilot or self-driving cars, do you think that there will still be traffic accidents in the future? Do you think that there'll ever be a time where there's never ever a traffic accident again? I'm cynical enough that I don't think that's ever going to happen, because people are still going to be capable of making poor decisions and doing dumb things that will result in equipment malfunctioning and bad things happening. So I think, similarly with even no matter how, many hoops we make our users jump through to authenticate properly or to make sure that their data is protected, all of us, every single one of us, me and everyone in this room, we are capable of making poor decisions and doing silly things. So even as the technology advances, I think the problem is just going to keep, slipping away from us and making us having to work harder to provide that protection. So to sum it up, I think, as security professionals, our charge is not only to understand how the technology works, but how people interact with it. Because very often it's not that technology is broken as such, but somebody figures out that it's a good technology, that it was implemented poorly, or it's a good technology, but the users are doing silly things, or that they can be tricked into divulging information that's useful to the bad guys. So I guess the good news is that we will have jobs, certainly for the foreseeable future. But I think if we consider the story of how these two huge infrastructures started in one place, ended up in a very, very different place, we can see that it's a very similar trajectory that's taking, and hopefully that will be useful as this conversation continues as we go back to work and move through our careers. So that's basically what I've got. I certainly appreciate y'all showing up and listening to this. I'll be around for a bit after here, and of course around the Wall of Sheep. If anyone wants to get in touch, that's me. My contact information is in that QR code. I promise I didn't put anything malicious in it. This is DEF CON, but yeah, that's me. If there's comments or questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of DEF CON 24. Thank you very much.